The rain was hitting the kitchen window so hard I couldn't hear my own thoughts. I sat there in the dark, clutching a cold cup of tea, waiting for the headlights to sweep across the driveway. My mom had been gone for 3 hours, headed to her sister's place 2 towns over, and the house felt too big. Then, the floorboards groaned in the hallway. I didn't hear a car pull up. I didn't hear the front door unlock. But when I turned around, my Uncle Mark was standing in the shadows of the door frame. He was dripping wet, his coat clinging to his shoulders like a second skin. He didn't say hello, and he didn't smile. He just stared at me with eyes that looked like they hadn't seen sleep in a week. I reached for the light switch, but his voice stopped me before my fingers could graze the plastic. "Don't turn that on," he whispered. I froze. The house was silent, except for the rhythmic drip of water falling from his sleeve onto the hardwood floor. Uncle Mark had always been the steady one in our family. When my father died 4 years ago, Mark was the one who caught us before we hit the ground. He handled the funeral arrangements, the mortgage papers, and the broken pipes in the basement. He was the good brother, the one who stayed sober and kept his promises. To me, he was more than just an uncle. He was the last piece of my father I had left. We had a routine. Every Sunday, he'd come over for dinner, tell me stories about their childhood, and check the tire pressure on my car. He was safe. He was the person I called when the world felt too loud. But that night, the safety was gone. The man standing in my kitchen didn't look like the hero who fixed my leaky faucets. He looked haunted, his face gaunt and pale under the moonlight filtering through the storm clouds. I felt a sudden, sharp prickle of unease at the back of my neck. He took a step forward, his heavy boots squelching. I realized then that he wasn't supposed to be there. My mom hadn't mentioned he was coming over, and he never visited when she was away. It was a rule we never spoke out loud, a boundary that kept everything simple. "Are you okay?" I asked, my voice trembling more than I wanted it to. He didn't answer right away. He just kept looking at me, his gaze moving from my face to the empty chair where my father used to sit. The air in the room felt thick, like I was trying to breathe underwater. The shift started when he sat down at the table without being asked. He didn't take off his wet coat. He just slumped into the chair, his hands trembling as he pressed them flat against the wood. He looked at the kitchen clock, then back at me. "I thought you'd be sleeping," he said. His voice was low, gravelly, and stripped of its usual warmth. I told him I couldn't sleep with the storm and that Mom would be back by morning. He flinched when I mentioned her name, his knuckles turning white against the table. He started talking then, but it wasn't the kind of talk we usually had. He didn't ask about my classes or my job. He started talking about the summer of 1998, the year I was born. He spoke about my father in a way I'd never heard before, not as a hero, but as a man who was drowning. He said my father had secrets that were rotting the foundation of our house long before the accident happened. I tried to interrupt, to tell him he was tired and needed to go home, but he held up a hand. His eyes were fixed on mine now, and for the first time, I saw a flash of something that looked like desperation. The more he talked, the more the room seemed to shrink. He told me about a night very much like this one, years ago, when a choice was made that changed everything. I felt a cold knot forming in my stomach. I wanted to get up and walk away, but my legs felt like lead. He leaned in closer, the scent of damp wool and something metallic filling my nose. He told me that everyone thought my father was a saint, but saints don't leave behind the kind of mess he did. I asked him what he meant, but he just shook his head and laughed, a dry, hollow sound that made me shiver. The secrets started stacking up like a house of cards. Mark began explaining things that didn't make sense. He talked about money that went missing from the family business. He talked about a woman my father knew, a name I'd never heard before. Every detail felt like a punch to the gut. I reached for my phone on the counter, thinking I should call my mom, but his hand shot out and covered mine. It was cold, unnaturally cold. "Leave it," he snapped. I pulled my hand back, my heart hammering against my ribs like a trapped bird. He apologized immediately, his voice cracking, but the damage was done. The trust was gone. I looked at the door, calculating the distance. If I ran, could I make it out into the rain before he caught me? And why was I even thinking about running from my own uncle? He started pacing the kitchen, his wet boots leaving dark smears on the floor. He told me he couldn't carry it anymore. He said the guilt was eating him alive, and that seeing me grow up looking just like my father was a daily reminder of what he'd done. "What did you do, Mark?" I whispered. I used his name instead of uncle. The shift in the room was palpable. He stopped pacing and turned to face me. He looked smaller then, as if the weight of his confession was physically crushing him. He told me about the night of the accident. He told me my father wasn't alone in the car. He told me they were arguing about the money, about the lies, about the life they were both pretending to lead. My breath hitched. The official report said my father had fallen asleep at the wheel. Mark took a deep breath, his chest heaving. He said he was in the car behind him. He watched the headlights veer off the road. He watched the car tumble down the embankment. And then, he told me the thing that broke my world into 1,000 pieces. He said he didn't call for help right away. He stood at the top of the hill and waited. He waited because he knew that if my father survived, the truth would come out, and both of them would lose everything. He waited until the silence from the wreckage was absolute. The point of no return came when he reached into his pocket and pulled out a small, tarnished silver lighter. It was my father's, the one he supposedly had on him when the car caught fire. Mark held it out to me, his hand steady now, his eyes pleading for something I couldn't give him. I reached for it. I don't know why. I took it, and it felt like I was holding a piece of lead. He leaned over and whispered the words that changed my entire life. "I didn't just watch him die," he said. "I'm the one who told him the brakes were fixed." The silence that followed was deafening. He had sabotaged the car. My hero uncle had murdered my father because of a business debt and a web of lies. He didn't just fail to save him, he ensured he wouldn't survive the night. He slumped back into the chair, looking at me as if he expected me to forgive him. He said he did it for us. He said he did it to protect my mother and me from the shame of what my father had become. He thought his confession would set him free, but all it did was lock me in a cage with him. I didn't scream. I didn't cry. I just sat there looking at the man I thought I knew, realizing he was a stranger. The man who had tucked me in, the man who had walked me across the stage at graduation, was a killer who had been playing a part for 4 years. I told him to leave. My voice was flat, devoid of any emotion. He started to protest, to tell me that he loved me, but I didn't want to hear it. I stood up, the chair screeching against the floor, and pointed toward the door. "If you don't leave right now, I'm calling the police," I said. He looked at me for a long time, searching for a spark of the niece who used to idolize him. He didn't find it. He slowly stood up, his movements heavy and tired. He walked to the door without another word, his shadow stretching long and distorted across the kitchen floor. When the door clicked shut, I didn't lock it. I didn't move. I just stood there in the dark, holding my father's lighter. The house felt colder than it ever had before. Every corner seemed to hold a secret. Every shadow felt like a lie. The fallout was slow and agonizing. I didn't call the police that night. I was too afraid of what it would do to my mother, too afraid of the wreckage it would leave behind. But I couldn't look at her the same way either. I wondered if she knew. I wondered if her grief was as performative as his protection. I stopped answering his calls. I stopped going to family dinners. My mother asked me what happened that night. Why Mark didn't come around anymore, but I couldn't tell her. How do you tell someone that their safety net is made of thorns? Mark moved away 6 months later. He sent a letter once, but I burned it without opening it. I didn't need his explanations or his apologies. The damage was done. The version of my life I thought was real had been a carefully constructed illusion, and he was the architect. I still live in that house, but it's not a home anymore. It's just a place where things are kept. I find myself checking the brakes on my car 3 times before I drive. I find myself flinching when the floorboards groan in the hallway. There is a quietness in my life now that feels like a scar. I chose to keep the secret, to protect my mother from a truth that would destroy her, but that choice came with a price. I am the keeper of the family's darkness now. Every time I see a silver lighter or hear the sound of rain against a kitchen window, I'm back in that moment. I'm back in the dark, looking at a man who wasn't a hero. I'm back in the silence that followed his confession. I used to be afraid of the dark because I thought there were monsters under my bed. Now I'm afraid of the light because it shows me exactly who the people I love really are. Sometimes I sit in the kitchen and wait for a knock that never comes. I'm not waiting for Mark to come back and apologize. I'm waiting for the person I was before that night to walk through the door and tell me it was all a dream. But the rain never stops, and the house never feels empty enough. I realize now that the most dangerous thing about a secret isn't the truth itself. It's the way it makes you look at the people you trust and realize you never really knew them at all. I looked in the mirror this morning and saw my father's eyes looking back at me. I wondered if he knew his brother was watching him from the top of that hill. I wondered if his last thought was a secret he never got to tell. He told me he did it to protect us. He told me he was the good one. But as I watched the rain wash away his footprints on the porch that night, I realized the most terrifying truth of all. The man who saved us was only making sure there was no one left to tell us who he really was.